Hi, I'm Mandy Medley, one of the worker owners here at Pilsen Community Books, and I'm so excited to welcome you here tonight to celebrate Eating Wild Japan with Winifred Bird, Poynter and Azby Brown. A couple of notes about how this evening will go. First, I'll introduce our tonight's guests, and then we'll hear a little bit from Winnie, and then our three guests will be in conversation. And at the end, there will be time for questions and answers, so if you have any questions at all, anytime during the event, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll make sure they get read out at the appropriate time. And I would also be remiss if I didn't mention, if you purchase Eating Wild Japan from Pilsen Community Books, we'll ship it to you, and you'll also receive a beautiful signed book plate from Winnie. So don't miss out on that, and I'll be sure to put the link in the chat. Also, if we happen to get disconnected, if there's internet problems, just click on our YouTube channel, and we will resume streaming there. You'll find us again. We won't be gone forever. Okay, I think that's all of the announcements, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's guests. Winifred Bird is a writer, translator, lifelong cook, and lover of plants, both wild and domesticated. For close to a decade, she lived in rural Japan, where she worked as an environmental journalist, grew organic rice and vegetables, and ate as many foraged foods as possible. That sounds like heaven, actually. She currently lives with her family in Oregon, Illinois. And Poynter is an artist, illustrator, tree climber, and woodsman living in Matsumoto, Japan. And you'll have to tell us where you are right now, Paul, because it's absolutely beautiful. And Azby Brown is a native of New Orleans and has lived in Japan since 1985. He is a leading authority on Japanese architecture, design, and environmentalism, and the author of The Genius of Japanese Carpentry, Small Spaces, The Japanese Dream House, The Very Small Home, and Just Enough, Lessons in Living Green from Traditional Japan. Since the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster in March 2011, Azby has been the lead researcher for SafeCast, a highly successful global volunteer-based citizen science organization devoted to developing new technology platforms for crowdsourced environmental monitoring, which promote open source and open data principles. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Vinny.
Well, thank you so much for having us tonight. I'm really excited to be here. I'd like to start out by expressing our solidarity with the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities and condemning the recent and historic violence against these groups, as well as the white supremacism that underlies those attacks. This book owes its existence to Japanese culture and to the many, many people who generously shared that culture with me. So I hope that it can play one tiny part in counteracting some of the simplistic stereotypes that contribute to anti-Asian racism. So with that, I will get to the book. I will start out by reading an excerpt from Eating Wild Japan. So this is from the introduction to the book, and it's about a neighbor of mine in rural Japan who kind of drew me into the world of foraging. Her name was Ban-san. San is the kind of honorific suffix attached to her last name, which is Ban. And Ban-san was in her 80s when we met. I was in my 30s, but we connected as writers and readers, lovers of good food and nature. So this is a little bit about our relationship. When Ban-san discovered I had a taste for sansai, as the Japanese call wild mountain vegetables, she invited me to come picking with her. She owned a patch of steep meadow a 5-minute walk from her house, past the temple, but just before the spot where the road disappeared into dark forests. Aside from mowing a few times a year to hold back the advance of the trees, she and her husband generally left the land to its own devices. The day she took me there was in early May, and the grass was already knee-high. As she led me along the concrete sluice that carried spring water through the middle of the meadow, she plucked little handfuls of this and that, instructing me on what to do with each plant. The curly warabi or bracken fiddleheads would need to be soaked in hot water and ash overnight to take away their bitterness, before being simmered with soy sauce and dashi broth. The kogomi fiddleheads were easier. They could simply be blanched and served with ground sesame seeds, as could the garlicky gyoja ninniku alpine leeks. Tempura would transform the taro no me, or Japanese angelica tree buds, into a delicacy, while the young azami or thistle and fuji vetch would make good boiled greens. Who would have guessed that an overgrown meadow held such delicacies? Soon our basket was full, and we slipped into a little wooden shack in a corner of the meadow to eat cookies and drink steaming hot tea from Bansan's thermos. We talked for a few minutes, then headed home. That was all, a simple stroll to enjoy the afternoon and gather a few things for dinner. Yet I was captivated by the thought that she kept this little patch of land for the express purpose of escaping the rigorously human world of the farming community we lived in, where every field was utilized with strict efficiency and every wild plant was viewed as a weed. Here, she was the student rather than the master of nature, carefully tracking the seasons so as to catch every one of their fleeting gifts. She was not rich. Her husband had been a caretaker at a nearby nursing home, and she had carved wooden partridges to sell to tourists. So I am sure Sansai brought welcome variety to their table. But I suspect she was more interested in the pleasure of picking and the incidental beauty she found along the way than in anything as practical as nutritional content. When I have been working hard for a while, my shoulders tighten and my head begins to ache, and the sadness in my heart spreads. At those times, there is no greater cure than to wander in the hills behind my house, she wrote in a 1989 essay about picking sansai in the same meadow she took me to more than 20 years later. As I learned more about sansai from Bansan and my other neighbors, I began to wonder how these foods fit into Japan's rice-centered culture. I had heard much about the profound ways paddy agriculture shaped Japan's spirituality, foodways, social structures, and physical landscapes. As anthropologist Emiko Onikitierney writes in her fascinating book, Rice as Self, rice is food of Shinto and the staple of elite diets since it took hold in Japan over 2,000 years ago, though commoners did not eat it frequently until much more recently. Each grain was thought to have a soul, and for many centuries, people believed that consuming rice gave them sacred energy and power. Because taxes were based on the assessed yields of rice in a given territory, the crop came to represent wealth and power for lords and the good life for everyone else. Rice was the most prominent symbol of the seasons and even of nature itself, while the act of growing it came to represent the quintessential Japanese lifestyle. Paddy farming dictated how water was used and what habitats were available for wildlife. But what about wild foods? Given that they were so ubiquitous, why hadn't I read more about them in books on Japanese history? I began to wonder how foraging had influenced culture, cuisine, and relationships with nature. The answers I found, or more accurately, my search for answers, in the many corners of Japan where old cultures and ways of eating still linger, became the framework for this book.
That was wonderful.
Yeah. Maybe should I just take over from here? Yeah, okay. Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm Azby Brown. And first, Mandy, I want to say thank you for hosting this event for Winnie and her book, and really happy to be here. And glad to be here to talk with Winnie and with Paul. And we're in this odd time now. None of us have met in real life. And, you know, I look forward to it at some point. And Paul and I are not that far away. I'm in Yokohama. And Paul, where are you right now?
I'm temporarily in Okutama, just the west side of Tokyo.
In the beautiful mountains and beautiful, we see blooming sakura, cherry trees, and I assume sakura, just such a beautiful area. And yeah, so Winnie, thanks for reading that. one thing that struck me about the book, which I really liked, is your writing is so beautiful. And I was just rereading it, kind of preparing for this event as well. You capture and you convey the humanity of, the people who you encountered, how you met them. You beautifully set the scene of their lives and the places they live, and maybe their homes, but of course the natural surroundings, the woods perhaps, or in some cases the ocean. And that's just really one of the most meaningful parts of it for me, because we think of, we're in a world where we find everything on the internet. We can look at a cookbook, go buy some bracken. Well, you're really bringing across, how these things relate to people in their day-to-day life, and that's something I really, really love about it. And I guess as we met. I think we got in contact because of my book about Edo period Japan sustainability called Just Enough, which Mandy mentioned in the introduction, and I sort of learned a little bit about what you're writing about. And then when the publisher sent me your book, I just was amazed at the depth that you had investigated and conveyed, and you're really seeing this as a totality, something that has both a geographic extent, around the country, around the archipelago, and then this great depth of time that you were sort of referring to earlier. This is the way Japanese people have eaten for millennia, and this is stuff that just really, really, resounds for me, and I just want to say thank you again. And Paul, again, we haven't met, and I wasn't aware of your work until I heard about this event and saw this beautiful video of you. You're an arborist, right? Which I don't think a lot of people know what that even is. And there is this beautiful video of you dangling rope lines through the tree canopy, climbing up, these massive trees. And growing up in New Orleans, we had beautiful trees. We had beautiful live oaks, which were easy to climb. Loved climbing these beautiful trees. I am so envious of
Those
that.
branches along and they sweep down to the floor.
Yes,
right?
they come down to the level, and you just climb up, and you climb up very high. And I found myself feeling like that must be so liberating. I mean, terrifying perhaps, but liberating. And here you are, an arborist who draws. I thought that's really, pretty unique. So,
well, I'm a person who draws who became an arborist. I guess it's that.
Is that how it worked out for you? Well, you want to tell us a little bit about that and how you and Winnie met?
Winnie, I came over in the tail end of 2011, and I started to want to go and explore and play in the woods. And my wife's parents often spoke about the black bears in Japan. So I became a little bit concerned, about the safety of going off on my own, and I just wanted to investigate it. And I came across one of Winnie's articles. I think that you wrote on the Japan Times.
Yeah.
I can't remember the sequence of events, but I then moved from Mie Prefecture to Matsumoto, and for some reason I contacted Winnie, and it turned out that she also lived in Matsumoto. She'd gone from the same area to the same area. It was quite bizarre. So we hooked up to, I think I invited you over to come and check out a workshop that I was running about a physical-led approach to arboriculture with Robert, right? That was the beginning.
Yes,
So
yes.
that's where it came from.
So that's great. So you did spend time together. So that's really
Yes.
fascinating.
Oh, yeah, we did, yeah.
Yeah, and so much of this, of Winnie's book, and of course, Paul, your work, it centers on the forest. And, there are forests all over the globe, and maybe Japanese forests are different in some special or significant way. I do want to talk about Winnie, in yourself. Did you spend a lot of time in forests elsewhere, like in the U.S., et cetera, or was Japan really a time where you found yourself really getting involved because of this, sansai?
Yeah, I think I did get more involved. I've always loved the countryside. I've always loved going on trips to state parks and things like that in the United States. But when I moved to Japan around 2005 for a number of reasons. I started to spend more time in the forests. One reason was that my ex-husband was a carpenter. He built log houses, and he would start by going out to the woods and cutting down trees, or being given trees that other logs people weren't using. So we would be in the woods all the time, helping him with that kind of work. Also, just by virtue of the way that the Japanese landscape is organized, I feel you're always much closer to the forest. It's never much of a drive or a walk to get out into the woods and then back again into a human community. So there's a lot more back and forth, I feel like. And then when I did move to Nagano Prefecture, where there's a very strong culture of foraging edible wild plants, I began to be interested in that and, poke around for that reason as well, and have people show me a bit of that. So that's where this subject of this book kind of came into play as well.
Yeah, and so much of it deals with the Satoyama, which is again one of those things that's difficult to translate. How do you translate Satoyama?
I guess I describe it as woods that are not entirely wild and not entirely cultivated. They're not tree farms. They're not wild forests. They're somewhere in between. They've been shaped by human use over long periods of time. They're usually surrounding villages, and they're areas of woodland that people have used for charcoal, to gather wood to make charcoal, or logs to make grow mushrooms on, or branches or greenery to turn into green manure. I think you talk about that in your book as well, to mix into the paddies. That was a very important use of the Satoyama woodlands. And the way that people have used those forests over the years has shaped their ecology and the types of species that are able to grow in them. And there's different types of Satoyama, but a lot of them tend to be deciduous forests, in contrast to the evergreen forests that grow in other areas, or plantation forests are often cedars and things like that. Paul, you also know lots about this, so you can probably.
I don't. So within the Satoyama and the sansai you found there, is that quite? So say you're in a Satoyama in Matsumoto, and then you go out deeper into the forest. Is there a pronounced difference in the sansai you'll find between the two places?
Yes, there is. I guess I would say that the unique feature of the deciduous woodland type Satoyama is that they're very open and sunny in the spring, in the early spring, because the leaves haven't come out yet on the trees. So the sunshine reaches the forest floor, and you have all kinds of wonderful plants, edible plants coming up that you can eat. You have like the fiddlehead ferns, the kogomi, and you have maybe wasabi if you have a little creek, and you have yomogi, you have fuki, butterbur, you have all kinds of things. So if you're out in, of course, if you're in an evergreen forest, you won't have as much growing on the forest floor. If you are in a wild, natural deciduous forest, you may have some of the same. For example, a beech forest, you will have some of the same spring species, but I guess that would be one of the main differences.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's beautiful too. The soil play a role, and maybe Paul. I mean, my understanding is that evergreen forest, the soil is more acid. I mean, this may be too geeky, but I think that may affect some of the species that grow in the forest floor as well.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the UK too, and I guess in many other countries post World War II, these evergreen plantations were planted as monoculture mass, and then the bottom fell out of the economy of the forestry industry, so they've just been left. And they're often described as, from the outside they look very green, and then you go to the inside and they're just desert-like. Yes, so very thin soil, very poor quality. land erosion, and nothing really grows within that space. So
Yeah.
it's not a good healthy place really.
Yeah, Japan, and actually, Winnie, you referred to the writing of Conrad Totman in your book, and he's of course someone I learned a lot from reading his work. And for those who don't know, he's a forest specialist. I think he was at Yale. And really good books about Japanese forestry, and talk about these plantation forestry, and that it really began in Japan in the Edo period, in some places even earlier. That the country was deforested during the Great Warring States period before the 16th or the 17th century, and the Edo period began, and then they reforested it. This incredible sort of nationwide program to restore the forests as the key, the linchpin of the entire environment. They were starting to see this whole environmental collapse. I mean, if it's deforested, you have soil problems, you have, the watershed is damaged. If the watershed is damaged, you may have uncontrolled flooding. If you have uncontrolled flooding, then you're damaging the agricultural land, and it's just this cascading, terrible problem. And they managed to pull it around, and which is really a fantastic thing. So, but it's true, these conifers, especially the cedars, this has been a plantation forest nation for centuries. And again, deforested during the 20th century, especially for the Second War. And now we have forests in a very kind of poor condition. Another thing that Topman pointed out, and I think you referred to, Annie, is that, before agriculture, and you were talking about that, it was such a beautiful environment for hunters and gatherers. Again, great environment, great water, great variety, the mountains are bad for agriculture maybe, but they're good for hunters and gatherers. And there may be possible that agriculture was sort of delayed in Japan compared to mainland Asia, partly because they didn't need it. They had enough food probably, and they had a great variety of food, and they were eating the same things that you're writing about, mainly these sansai, what we call sansai, which are still delicacies and seasonal delicacies, but used to be essential nutrition. So that's wonderful to me. And there's one sort of related thing, this idea that sansai is sort of a special thing. And as you do point out, some of them can be cultivated, and some can't, or some won't. But it's a part of lots of life. And you talk about Mr. Koriki at the Afan Trust in Nagano, and that was started by C.W. Nicol, who you refer to. I've only met him once, but he was just a giant in environmental awareness in Japan. And you have this wonderful statement: to throw a few wild vegetables onto a lacquered dinner tray as a symbol of spring is practically a cliche of the Japanese country inn. To serve them without fail from spring through fall is evidence of immense foraging skill. I loved that.
Yeah. He was immensely skilled. He spent his life, in the forests, and also running a guest house. So sansai for him, he said, were like an expression of his affection for his guests and his love, to take the time throughout the entire season to find the most delicious things at the peak of their deliciousness, which is really a tradition that goes back so deep into Japanese history. There's a poem that I quote in the beginning of the book, by Emperor Koko. It's from it's the 8th century maybe, where he's essentially saying the same thing. He says, I'm going out in the fields in the early spring to pick sansai, to pick wild greens for my beloved, whoever it is, someone he loves. So it's that same expression of, or way in which those plants connect people to each other and are used by people to symbolize so many different things, and not only to connect them to the land, but connect them to each other, which is really something I came to appreciate while I was writing the book.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, for me, really kind of starting to investigate sansai after Winnie asked me to do these illustrations. As an artist, eating something that you just pluck from the ground and you can literally put straight in your mouth, it's the most aesthetically pleasing way to eat, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And then, and obviously to pass that on to someone that you enjoy spending time with, it's the most precious of gifts.
Yeah, certainly. I enjoy it. I'm from Louisiana, from New Orleans, and it's a very different kind of forest environment and natural environment. It's more swamps. We would do camping and Boy Scouts in the swamps and stuff. But there was berries. I remember picking berries and things like that. There must have been a lore of wild foods that I simply was not aware of, though. And this is something else that I was thinking about a lot is, when I was researching the Satoyama, I realized that, in previous generations, certainly until the industrial age and well into the 20th century, it was an essential environment for supporting daily life because of the resources that you pointed out, because it was a source of fuel when they were not using fossil fuels. It was wood or charcoal, because of the food supply, because of these things, and it's became inessential because of the developments in food distribution and agricultural growth, and also for fuel. And now there is a revival movement, to make people more aware of it. But it's kind of almost like entertainment. People go, I want to try it. And the Japanese word is taiken. Let's experience Satoyama. The issue for me is that there's not a lot of people who still know about it. And you refer to people being 80 years old. I think the person that you mentioned in the beginning, 80 years old, and I've had this experience as well. You have to talk to people who are in their 80s to find people who really, really know this stuff well, and it has to be passed down generation to generation, by experience. You can't learn it in a book. You have to go with somebody and they'll show you. So we've had just centuries and centuries of people going with their grandmother or grandfather and then just showing this is that, you can eat this, don't eat that. I don't know, Paul, in your case as an arborist, in terms of this knowledge of trees, do you find do you find this knowledge is also vanishing? Do you find that the elder generation really, really knows things that the younger people don't anymore?
Well, I don't know about that, but it's to find younger people to begin working in this job, and that's really one of the main reasons that we made that very beautiful video, to try and entice people, to kind of hoodwink them into it. Wow, this looks so great. We want to call people into it, and as soon as they come into it, they realize what an amazing job and lifestyle it can be. But yeah, from a distance, from the outside, I don't see why anybody would be interested when they can be in air-conditioned spaces, they can have their television, all this kind of thing. So it's a very kind of sad state of affairs, in my opinion.
Yeah. I'd like to hear from both of you is about perception. And so, Paul, you spend just almost every working day, I'm thinking, in the woods, in the forest, in the treetops, with those smells and those sounds and that exposure to the elements and to the wind. How has your perception changed by spending so much time being attentive in the woods? Can you talk about that?
Very difficult question to answer. Very deep question. I would say that I've been doing it for 16 years, and I'm a very different person than I was. And that's certainly true. And I'm not sure how to explain this, but I know that trees teach me. They've put me on a certain path in my life, and that's certainly the guidance that I get from working with trees. And from the beginning, I tried to be quite anti-intellectual about it. I wanted to be just playful and physical, and that's really my kind of whole approach to being a tree worker. Yeah, the smells. If something looks delicious, as most things do in the spring, break a leaf off and taste it. It's this kind of very simplistic approach, but it's a wonderful thing. It's changed my life for sure.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Winnie. Yeah.
First of all, to anyone who's listening in the audience, do not go out into the woods and break something off and eat it. Just a small disclaimer.
I have a little amount of knowledge about what I am putting into my mouth.
We don't want anyone killing themselves as a result of this talk. Please study about the plants first. But that said, Yeah, I think through the process of writing this book and spending a lot of time thinking about not only being out in the woods, but in my case, thinking about what this means for a culture and how does foraging change relationships to nature and just change how people are in the world. So I started to. It has changed my way of thinking and helped me to begin to realize some very obvious things which somehow I had failed to realize previously. So there's an expression I learned when I was researching the book. Somebody taught it to me. Actually, it was Koriki, the same guy you mentioned earlier. It goes Shindo Fuji. It means essentially body and earth, one and the same. That's my translation. I'm sure you could translate it in many different ways. But I've spent so much time thinking about this. It seems very obvious at first. It's essentially saying we are part of the world. Of course, we are part of the world. We're human beings. We live on planet Earth, but somehow we manage to forget that we are part of the Earth. That we are made out of the plants in our environment, especially if we eat locally. We are made, in any case, from the plants on the earth. Oftentimes we're taking them in from far distant places. It makes it easier to forget that when we're foraging, when we're gathering in our local environment, at least for me, it helps me to begin to realize that I am literally made of this place, and it will be made of me when I die as well, hopefully, unless I'm stuck in a metal box in the ground somewhere. And recently I've been kind of coming to realize that this is to be able to eat from the land where you live and to get nourished from it is really the most essential human right there can be. It really is just the right to exist in the world and, to be in it in the way that other living creatures are in the world. So not necessarily manipulating it or transforming it like we do with agriculture and gardening. I love to garden. I'm all about gardening, but foraging creates a different relationship where we take from the land and we give back, and we're simply present in it without necessarily manipulating it in that same way. And of course, it's this very basic thing that every human being should be able to do, to go out and pick something and eat it and be nourished by it. But sadly, there are just millions and millions of people who can't do that. Our whole society kind of moves toward taking that right away from people through colonialism, through industrialization, pollution of the air and the water and the soil. Nuclear disaster did that in Japan. It severed people's relationship and their ability to connect with the land in that way. The way that our cities are built, the way that they don't incorporate nature, especially in poorer neighborhoods, that it takes away that relationship from people. And sometimes we can minimize these things as just kind of fluffy, like, oh, people should be able to go out in the park. But they're really incredibly important fundamental rights that I think we need to be focusing more attention on.
Yeah, no, that's well put. That's really well put. For so much of, for these things, let's say for forests, for foraging, for natural food sources, et cetera, there has been this great detachment through the industrialization process, and often it's a clear break. In the case of Japan, the Meiji period, and again, fossil fuels, that was a clear break, which led to where we are now. And I guess what I'm getting from what you're talking about is just understanding the importance of our own interdependence on the natural world, which used to be much more legible. It was clearer. You could go through, and it's almost as if you're walking in the woods. If you're seeing things with knowledge, This is edible, that's not edible, this is that. It's as if they're speaking to you, right? And you are listening and you're aware, and you understand this. And we talked earlier a little bit about the scale of time that these environments, although humans have shaped, for instance, Satoyama, it really existed long before humans and will probably continue to exist long after us. And one thing that I learned through my research with temple carpenters, the Miyadaiku, is the brevity of human life compared to this great span of time, the thousands of years of trees, of forests, etc. It really is a very, very brief thing. And then there were some things that you pointed out about, again, the environment, like what kind of environment or microclimate or sub-environment is likely to allow certain plants to emerge. And you talked, one thing that really struck me was you talked about the bamboo and this gregarious flowering that happens with the bamboo. And you said in the wild, bamboo flowering cycles sometimes control the growth cycles of other plants. And you talk about beech forests. And maybe you want to tell me a little more about that, because this was beautiful for me, that we don't often realize that, it's because of the way that some plants or trees, etc., grow in their cycles that other plants are allowed to grow. And they are sort of this interdependent entire ecosystem. So and humans then become part of that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. These stories that unfold over the span of centuries, exactly just like you were talking about. So a lot of species of bamboo do what is called gregarious flowering. So all the bamboo, sometimes across vast areas, like, nationwide scale, will not flower for many years, so decades and decades, they won't flower. And then all at the same time, all of them will flower at once and produce seed, and then die. So first of all, this creates the problem sometimes of like pest infestations. Well, from whatever perspective, from a human perspective, it's sometimes an infestation when you have like millions of rats coming in to eat all the bamboo seeds and then moving on to the human crops to devour them as well. But another thing that happens, for example, you had mentioned Chishimasasa, a kind of bamboo that grows in northern Japan on the understory of beech forests. So when it's so dense and vigorous that when it's alive, nothing else can get through. Beech seedlings can't grow because there's so much of this bamboo sometimes. And when it dies back every whatever it is, I can't remember, 50 years, that's the opportunity for the forest to renew itself and the seeds that have been waiting there patiently to sprout. So that was also something that really surprised me in the research.
It's like a 60-year cycle, everything you're saying, a very multi-decade cycle. That's really beautiful, isn't there? There's other living things that sort of seem to do that. I'm thinking of jellyfish and or things that somehow all reproduce at the same time and have this massive effect across a certain ecosystem. But I didn't know that about the bamboo. I don't think I've ever seen that. I wonder how I would know if I would see it. Someone probably have to tell me.
Yeah. Start following the bamboo scientists on Instagram. Right. They'll tell you. Right?
Okay. And then eventually the bamboo sort of fights its way back, right?
Yes. So eventually the bamboo grows more and more. Yeah.
Yeah. So Paul, or is that something that you have to deal with, or is it just an annoyance, or how does that relate to what you're doing?
I would really love to become involved in kind of bringing back the beautiful bamboo groves that were, all over Japan. I'm not sure of the historical timeline, but I guess certainly pre-World War II, there were many uses for bamboo, and these bamboo groves were, they were well managed and just incredibly beautiful places. I'm not sure about what kind of sansai would grow within it, but certainly a lot of light would come through, and the way that you see it now is just heaps of just dead and broken, and just there's not a drop of sunlight within these places. So it's yeah, for me, I often go to places and I have to clear the bamboo out to then get into the trees and do what I have to do with the trees. Yeah, bamboo, it's an interesting material, interesting plant.
Yeah, very prolific, very fast growing. It's kind of a magic plant, right? In terms of material culture. So many uses, of course, bamboo shoots, takenoko is edible, but used for everything, right? Structural pipes, implements, beautiful. And of course, now in Japan, I'm glad to see little by little the old waribashi, the disposable chopsticks you would get when you buy a box of lunch, are more and more. I'm finding them made of bamboo, even in convenience stores in Tokyo. So I think that's kind of a positive thing.
Yeah, although the bigger trend, of course, is that we've taken this wonderful, sustainable thing that's a solution to many of our human problems and replaced it with an enormous problem of plastic, So now we've replaced all these products that were made with bamboo with plastic that becomes ocean pollution and all kinds of problematic things. And at the same time, the bamboo groves, which were once beautiful, lovely places, become environmental problems, taking over other areas of forest and just growing denser and denser.
Invasive, yeah.
Yeah. So we've made two problems out of.
Yeah, these are all connected things. I think anything else? I mean, Mandy, are we good? We have a little more time, or we have some questions, or do you want to just a little more? So one more magic plant, magic tree you talked about, Winnie, is the tochinoki, which is just another beautiful thing. And tell me about all of the uses and benefits of the tochinoki, which is the Japanese horse chestnut. I mean, one thing that struck me was you talk about that the nuts can be kept for like a decade.
Yeah.
To me, that was just something I didn't realize. That was kind of mind-blowing to me. Tell me about the tochinoki.
Yeah, so Japanese horse chestnuts are beautiful trees that grow all over Japan and have grown there for thousands and thousands of years. They are wonderful pollinator plants because they have these big kind of candelabras of flowers, fragrant flowers in the spring that feed all kinds of insects. And they have big holes, and they get pretty big and old, and they get holes in them that animals can live in, and they're very good in that sense. And their roots, they grow along rivers and streams, and their roots hold the soil in place. So they're very important for keeping dirt erosion out of the stream beds. And they are also they have historically been very important for humans as well. They were eaten quite extensively during the Jomon era and probably before then. There's these ancient shell mounds that are just full of their shells. Of course, acorns and chestnuts were also. They're very high in calories, and they're very large. Instead of that, good return on. So even after people started farming, in a lot of mountain villages in Japan, farming was very difficult through much of history because there wasn't much land, flat land, and also there weren't cold hardy varieties of rice and things like that. So there were frequent crop failures, and people would have to rely on other types of grains, but also wild foods. People would rely very heavily on wild foods, and in many places, the tochinomi, the horse chestnuts, were essential famine foods. So people would gather them every year and store them up in the eaves or in the attic, and the smoke would rise up and kind of help preserve them. And also they have natural resistance to insects and other pests because they're very bitter and they have toxic compounds in them that have to be leached out before they're edible. So they, as you said, they would last for a dozen years. So whenever you you would just put them up there, start stockpiling them, and then whenever you needed them, you could take some out and eat them. And this is what people did for centuries in the mountains. And then they would leach them. So I was able to, during my travels, I was observe people doing a traditional leaching and preparation process. So they would put them in baskets or something like that in a running stream for like 2 weeks just to start out, and then they would have to boil them with ash to leach out more of the toxic compounds, and then they would bleach them in water again, and then they would peel them, and then they had to take off the inner peel and cook them, and then they had to pound them. So it's incredibly labor intensive. But I at the same time, I feel like if you take into account all of the work involved in growing rice, especially before technology advanced, I don't know which one comes out as being more work over the long term.
Basically, you just pick them up off the ground. And one tochinuki will make thousands and thousands of nuts, right?
Yes, they're very productive.
Yeah. And it's interesting, this bitterness is something that comes up often in your book about, a lot of these foods are a little bitter or sometimes very, very bitter. And this is an interesting, let's say in terms of cuisine, it's always an interesting, taste range that, in Western cuisine, of course, we do have that, but I think maybe much more here.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, have you ever ascended a tochinuki?
Yeah, I remember seeing my first really big place called Hatfield Forest in Essex, which is in East England. And as I was traveling there, my colleague was describing how the branches were like rainbows. And I couldn't quite understand how a branch could be like a rainbow, but the big ones, they form a rainbow shape, and then they'll form a new rainbow shape. And they might do this 2 or 3 times, depending on the size of it. So really fun to be in and climb around.
Mm-hmm. So that's very broad. I mean, you're saying that the branches sort of arched?
Yeah. The branches are coming outwards and they arch up, and then they'll stop and they'll form a new arch descending downwards.
So it's almost like a structural aspect to help them get a broad expanse. You think maybe it's sort of structural?
I don't know why they form the rainbow shapes, but they seem to do that.
Yeah.
Did the ones in Japan? Did you notice they were like that, Winnie? I've never seen a huge one in Japan, actually.
I didn't. Fortunately, for this story, for this research, I was only able to see like one groves of them because it was the snow wasn't melted yet, so I wasn't able to go hiking in like the Tochi forest. But I did see some growing down by the river. But no, they didn't look like that.
I mean, there are a lot of horse chestnut trees in the southeast of England, and they're always just really fun. Big leaves, big flowers, and you mentioned about the pollination and the inside. It's a white flower. It can be a white flower that will turn red after pollination, so the bee will know to go on to the next one. So kids as well, they're just very easy to kind of fun and easy to understand. And they're really fun, these horse chestnuts. I love them.
That's great. Yeah. I guess that there's Satsumi is a parallel to the sort of forest version. It's kind of the husbanded, the managed oceanfront or oceanside, right? And in this case, it's about gathering and growing seaweed, which I had never really thought of as in the same category as sansai. And so it was really interesting, but there's all this deep culture involving that too. So that was an interesting decision to include it. Why? How did you end up deciding to include that rather than having some other, mountain vegetables or something?
Well, I mean, seaweed has just been such an important part of Japanese cuisine going back forever, really, and Japanese culture as well. It's certainly not sansai because the word sansai means mountain vegetable, but from an American perspective, we often talk about wild-crafted seaweed or foraged seaweed, so it kind of immediately came to mind as something I wanted to write about. I was really glad I did. I feel like the harvesting of wild seaweed is a practice that's being lost even more so than harvesting of sunset, which quite a lot of people still enjoy doing. In many parts of Japan, people used to harvest dozens of varieties of wild seaweed, and now it's really down just to a handful of varieties in most places. Many seaweeds are grown by aquaculture, and it just seems to have fallen out of practice for some reason more. But I was fortunate to spend some time on the Noto Peninsula, where there's still a thriving culture of wild-crafted seaweed. People harvest about 30 different varieties there and have all sorts of wonderful foods that they make out of them. So often they're harvested by the divers, divers, free divers, who go down without any scuba gear or anything. They'll wear a wetsuit, but they'll just free dive and go down and get shellfish and seaweeds. So yeah, it's a really unique culture that still exists there, in Noto and in Mie Prefecture, but really is kind of fading away in many parts of Japan.
Yeah.
I encountered ama on a small island just off the coast, and I was really taken aback to see a group of 5 or 6 ama sitting naked on the quayside. Wow, this is not Japan.
Right.
Wow.
Well, that's how it was, I mean, this is, as you mentioned, now they're more likely to have wetsuits and, stuff. But yeah, things change.
I'm not surprised to hear you saw this in Issei, though, because that's the other hotspot of ama culture, probably related to the Issei Jingu. Seaweed is often used in Shinto religious ceremonies as well, so I think it's been...
Winnie, I've not seen other aquaculture apart from the nori, which I really love. The horizontal netting set between the rise and fall of the tide. Is exposed, and then, wow, I just think it's such almost a poetic way to create a material. It's very beautiful.
Yeah, it is, and
the other ways to they do.
I would of kame using aquaculture, and I mean, I think it can be, seaweed aquaculture can be a really good thing, aside from like the poetic beauty of it. It can be very sustainable because you're not disturbing natural seaweed beds, and there's been a lot of problems with over harvesting, but I guess my concern was that it led to a whole lot of wakame in that one place, whereas there used to be a much more diverse variety of seaweeds that people used and harvested wild, and therefore had an investment or a reason to protect. So when they switched to aquaculture, they lost that kind of incentive to be nurturing the diversity and really just solely focused on wakame for their income and their livelihood.
Is that true of the nori as well? Environment?
I don't know much about nori, but I think it's true of any crop where you switch to it's essentially a monoculture. When you're using the wild resources, it's not really possible to depend on one specific crop, one specific species, because you can't get a reliable supply of it. So you're kind of forced to use lots of different things and make sure that all those different things are in the environment, because you never know how much you're going to get of one or the other.
Motivation and humans deciding that some species is more useful or desirable than another. We have monocultures and everything. Certainly, we talk about this in the forest and these sort of cedar monocultures in Japanese forests, and we see that in a lot of other places. And I was surprised to hear about it in the context of seaweed as well. But I can certainly understand how that's true. Yeah, there's so much other things that we could talk about. And
we do have a few questions if you want to take a few.
Some questions, yeah.
Some from the chat. Advice for beginning foragers, and also advice for people in America who want to try some of the recipes in the book. Like, is that possible? Would you advise it?
Yeah, sure. A lot of the species earlier, or some of their relatives, closely related plants. Here, there's a guide to plants at the back of the book where I try to mention if there's something similar you can use. In the United States, I do mention that. And I also mention if it's distributed, if that specific species is distributed in the United States. For example, kogomi, fiddleheads are a really classic Japanese bonsai, and they grow widely across the entire east coast of the United States. They're ostrich ferns. Fiddleheads. So my neighbor, someone living outside of my town, had a whole hillside full of them on her property. So I was able to feast on kogomi last spring. A lot of the weedier plants grow in many places around the world. I don't mention a lot of them in the guide to plants because I wanted to focus on the ones that were more unique to Japan. But of course, a lot of the recipes you can use things like dandelion greens or plantain or watercress or daylily shoots. Let me think. Anyway, plants like that. So many of the recipes you can basically the recipe section is intended to be a introduction to the different ways that people cook with wild plants in Japan, rather than specific recipes that only work with a specific plant. There's a few of those, but in most cases you can substitute whatever you have available.
It's poisonous. But go ahead and try it. There are many ways to approach it. You can try it raw, you can boil it, you can steam it, and then obviously deep frying, which I think Winnie mentioned in the book. It just puts this kind of deep fried taste to it. So that's usually the kind of the easiest way to eat it. But why not go and start looking and experience nature with kind of new eyes?
Yeah, and I would say don't be afraid to try it, but make sure that you are educated and you learn the plants, or go out with someone who knows what they're doing and get them to teach you a few to start with. And get a book about poisonous plants. That's a good idea.
Great. Well, we're almost. Oh, go ahead.
Because I spent a lot of time in Fukushima. I found taro no me on sale at a roadside stop, and I bought a bunch of that. And I was saying, well, how am I going to prepare this? Because I didn't want to make tempura. And I found a recipe for pasta using taro no me, which it worked really beautifully. Taro no me, what's another name for taro no me? What do we call that in English? I'm not sure if there's even an English name, but it's a little green shoot, kind of a delicate thing. And
Japanese angelica tree.
Find it. So I don't know if there's a similar one in North America or not, but it was good.
Well, we're almost out of time. Winnie, if you find the name.
Angelica.
America. So people may be able to eat it here.
Yeah, great.
A few last questions.
Is there another question?
Yes. Sorry, I think you're breaking up on my end, so if I'm interrupting, apologies. You're a little frozen. But people wanted to know, Paul, where to view your video. So I wanted to make sure that you gave that a shout out at the end. We had several questions for that. And then also, they wanted to know if they could buy Eating Wild Japan in Japan from an independent Japanese bookseller, Winnie, if you knew it, and also what you're working on for your next project.
Unfortunately, I don't know which specific bookstores in Japan have the book. Our distributor does distribute them to Japan. I think Marazen and Kinokuniya are two major bookstores that our distributor works with, but unfortunately, I have no specific information. So you'll just have to call around, I think. What am I working on? I have a few ideas for another project, but nothing specific yet that I can share.
I just want to add, in terms of, trying to purchase the book from like an independent bookseller, I always encourage people to go and ask for it by name. Just say, can you get me this book? And that's always really helpful. People know it's desired and maybe help get other sales.
So this is if you go to YouTube and with capitals, if you write Sora-shi, you will find it.
Awesome.
Well, would y'all like to share any last thoughts before we end this evening? It's been so lovely.
Thank you everybody for coming. Hope you enjoy the book, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions or thoughts.
I am glad to have this conversation. I knew we'd have a lot to talk about, and I knew it could go on longer, and it'd be great one day to actually meet and maybe over some wine or something and just sort of continue. And Paul, I do hope we can meet up before too long. There's some forests I'd like to. You're doing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.